This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help me produce more content like this and get early access to every new video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Hold up, man! Stop the steal! It's our country. We want it back! Fuck these Democrats! Where's that? This is our country! We don't kill you!
On January 6, 2020, the world bore witness to what can only be described as one of the dumbest days in American history. The hot takes started flying immediately, and the internet was bombarded with tweets and videos trying to determine what exactly we were all watching. What do we call it? Is it a coup? A riot? Was it planned? Who are these people? Did we know about it in advance? What do they want? I could have deviated from my normal release schedule to give my opinions, but I decided it would be more beneficial if I waited a bit, gathered some more information, and provided a more nuanced take on the event that has so captured our attention for the past week. This is a huge topic, and it involves a lot of other subtopics, so I'm going to break this video up into chapters. Hopefully by the end, you'll have a better picture of what transpired, why it happened, and what it means for the country going forward. Before we begin, I need to make a few things clear. First of all, the claim that Antifa was secretly behind the riot is not only wrong, it's incredibly stupid. We have mountains of video evidence of exactly who was at the Capitol, including live-streamed vlogs from well-known far-right figures. Conservatives have been calling for stopping the steal and overthrowing the government for months. Now that an attempt has been made, a lot of those same people, including Republican elected officials, are strangely silent. This is what you wanted. Own it. We'll get into the specifics of who was present at the event and who was guilty of inciting it shortly. But I want to make one more thing clear. Since Donald Trump was elected president, pundits, journalists, and average Americans have taken to using the term fascism a little too broadly. Let me be perfectly explicit here. There were fascist elements within the Capitol riot, but you have to use the term correctly because it is very important. When many people use the term fascist, they're simply describing authoritarian tendencies, which is where the bizarre conservative claim of left-wing fascism comes from. I'm making an entire series on the resurgence of fascism around the world, but to give you a better working definition in the meantime, fascism, at its core, can be defined as palingenetic ultranationalism. Palingenetic meaning a belief in and desire for the violent rebirth of a nation to overcome a period of moral decay, and ultranationalism meaning an overwhelming loyalty to a perverted vision of one's country, often laced with bigotry and racism. Be aware that for the remainder of this video, if I use the term fascism, I mean actual fascism, not vague authoritarianism. With that out of the way, let's begin with Chapter 1. What happened?
We can take that place. And then do what? Heads on pike!
On January 6, 2020, a crowd of thousands of Trump fanatics attended a rally in Washington, D.C., and after months of unofficial planning online and further encouragement from the president, they marched to the Capitol with one goal in mind: Stop the Steal. This slogan came to prominence in the aftermath of Joe Biden's electoral victory, as many diehard Trump supporters believed the Democrats to have stolen Trump's landslide win. This belief has absolutely no basis in reality, and before you call me a dirty lib, please note that I can't stand Joe Biden, and I think the Democrats are spineless and ineffective. But you cannot in good faith claim that Donald Trump won the election. And yet, here were thousands of people storming the grounds of the Capitol building, erecting crosses and Trump flags, breaking windows, getting into fights with Capitol Police, forcing open doors, and finally, running amok in the building. Rioters, many without a real purpose, took the opportunity to sit in various chairs, collect some souvenirs, and take selfies with suspiciously friendly police. Other insurrectionists did have concrete plans, some carrying zip-tie handcuffs in the hopes of kidnapping members of Congress, or, in the case of some of the more extreme QAnon fanatics, executing Vice President Mike Pence for supposedly betraying the president. For the next several hours, the Capitol was a scene of jubilation on the part of the rioters, looking more like an amusement park than a war zone. We saw all sorts of colorful characters at the riot, from wannabe Vikings to Special Forces cosplayers to people who still haven't gotten over the fact that the Confederacy lost their war 150 years ago. Seeing Confederate flags carried into the US Capitol as a sign of ultimate patriotism and loyalty to the nation is a truly fine example of irony. But the riot wasn't all fun and games. The spectacle claimed 5 lives. 4 rioters, and 1 Capitol Hill police officer, who was knocked unconscious with a fire extinguisher and then beaten to death by the patriotic mob, with weapons that included American flags. Meanwhile, members of Congress were hunkered down in the House chamber with armed security pointing their guns at the mob outside. Eventually, the politicians were all evacuated without accident, including a number of elected officials who had helped spread the conspiracy theory that led to the riot. The rioting continued for some time, Trump supporters seeking out mainstream news reporters and assaulting them and destroying their camera gear, accosting passersby and demanding to know who they voted for, and chanting all sorts of slogans, including "Hang Mike Pence." Finally, hours after the ordeal began, the president released a lukewarm video asking the rioters to go home, but also calling them very special people, and saying that this is what happens when elections are stolen from the rightful victors. Capitol Police and the National Guard managed to clear out the area later that night, and the dumbest day in recent memory was over. We'll get to why it was so ridiculous later on, but next, let's move to Chapter 2. Who are these people? As much as conservative figures would like us to believe that this riot wasn't a bunch of law-abiding white Christian Trump supporters, through the magic of modern technology, we have a very good idea of the types of people who took part in the insurrection, in no small part thanks to the participants themselves. Rioters took selfies, vlogged, and bragged about their activities on all their favorite platforms, giving the rest of the world a good look at who we're dealing with. Now, I know I've been snarky up to this point, but here we really do have to engage with a claim that deserves a bit of nuance. Many people on the right, and even some other sources, have made allusions or outright asserted that the Capitol riot was the result of working-class Americans being pushed too far. On the surface, this seems reasonable. Most Americans can agree that things haven't exactly been going well for the working class, regardless of your politics. Over the course of the pandemic, billionaires have become vastly more wealthy, while tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs, their health insurance, and their homes. The system favors the rich in this country. But to paint the Capitol crowd as honest, hardworking folks is less than accurate. For years, the media has loved to engage in rural diner fetishization, where they find a poor Trump supporter and condescendingly try to understand them. These people do exist, and it's a shame that they've been so lied to by the Republican Party. But from what we've seen from social media and coverage of the riot, a large percentage of the crowd was not working class at all, but rather wealthy conservatives who just wanted to be part of the excitement. Take these guys, for example, yelling at a handful of DC police.
Your fucking back, but we ain't got your back no more. We're the business owners. We're the veterans. We're the veterans. We're the business owners. We ain't your back, but we ain't got your back no more.
Business owners. These are the people that Republican policies benefit, not the workers these business owners employ. In the aftermath of the riot, the FBI was quick to put out a request to identify anyone at the event. The anti-Trump crowd was only too eager to oblige, which is a problem we'll discuss later. But regardless, what we've learned about the crowd so far should not be surprising. Among the attendees were the CEO of a tech company, lawyers, high-profile attorneys, Republican elected officials, both current and retired, the son of a Brooklyn Supreme Court judge, and this woman, a real estate broker from Frisco, Texas, who flew on her private jet with her wealthy friends to have some fun breaking windows. As is typical in America, the wealthy can brazenly commit crimes, brag about it, and face no consequences. This woman described the riot as one of the best days of my life. She went on to say, "This is a prelude to war. And if we know anything about war, it's that she will be far away watching all the commoners die while she and her rich friends continue to live lives of luxury. I won't disclose the names of any of the people I discuss in this section, unless they're already well-known or public figures. You can find them easily enough online if you're interested." The owner class was not the only group of people at the riot. There were also off-duty police and military personnel, who, according to official statements, flashed their badges and were simply let into the Capitol to wreak havoc. Seattle PD released a statement that at least 2 of their officers had attended the riot, and off-duty cops from all over the country flew in for the event. As we learned over the summer, where there are cops, there are white supremacists. And the Capitol Hill riot was full of them, both the really obvious kind and the kind that looks a bit more like your parents or your crazy uncle. The kind that don't see themselves as racist. As reported in The Nation, one woman said, "This is not America. They're shooting at us. They're supposed to shoot at BLM, but they're shooting the patriots." After months of trying to explain to people that the average white supremacist genuinely believes Black Lives Matter supporters are terrorists, here's a woman saying it out loud. Saying that America is supposed to shoot the people protesting police violence, not the people trying to overthrow the government for a loser president. As despicable and deeply absurd as that statement was, this woman represents the mildest form of white supremacists present at the rally. We also saw literal Nazis. This is where a lot of conservatives shake their heads and say, you can't call everyone you disagree with a Nazi. I'm not. I'm calling Nazis Nazis. This guy is wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt, bearing the words, "Work brings freedom." This one is wearing a shirt that means 6 million wasn't enough, referring to the number of Jews murdered during the Holocaust. Neo-Nazi social media personality Baked Alaska live-streamed from inside the Capitol. That Viking guy from all the pictures? That's Jake Angeli, known by many as the QAnon Shaman. That symbol he's got tattooed on his chest is widely used in Nazi and white supremacist groups under the guise of appreciating European heritage. We saw people flying the Kek flag, a symbol birthed in the bowels of 4chan, modeled after the swastika, and, like so many other internet symbols, easily dismissed as just a meme. NSC 131 was there. They're a neo-Nazi group based in New England and very active on Telegram. They said they would show up, and they did. Proud Boys founder and author of 10 Things I Hate About Jews, Gavin McInnes, was spotted at the riot too. So the next time someone claims the Trump cult is not totally infested with all manner of white supremacists, send them this video. We have photographic and video evidence. These people were all over the Capitol, and after the event, they were all over the internet, trying to convert the run-of-the-mill ignorant Trump supporters. Ironically, even having to explain to the less extreme conservatives that no, Antifa are not the real fascists, we the Nazis are the real fascists and you should join us. It's the type of thing that normal Americans would never expect to be going on in the political undercurrents of the internet, but here we are. So, we've seen business owners, millionaires, QAnon cultists, white supremacists, and literal Nazis in the crowd at the Capitol. Who else would you expect to see there? If you said Republican elected officials, congratulations, you're right. To anyone paying attention, it shouldn't come as a surprise that some of our fearless leaders took part in the insurrection. Many Republicans have been helping to spread the lie that Trump actually won the election. West Virginia state lawmaker Derek Evans was there, as were former Pennsylvania state representative Rick Saccone, Virginia state senator Amanda Chase, incoming co-chair of the Michigan Republican Party Michonne Maddock, Missouri state rep Justin Hill, Tennessee state rep Terry Lynn Weaver, Nevada state assembly member Annie Black, and likely others who were smart enough not to show their faces on camera. Other Republicans chose not to attend and instead tweet their support or pull the strings behind the scenes. Colorado Congresswoman Lauren Boebert tweeted out, "Today is 1776, and America is depending on all of us today. This is something I don't take lightly. I will fight with everything I have to ensure the fairness of the election." You know, like overthrowing the government and tossing out the legitimate results to reinstate the loser. Senator Josh Hawley offered a fist raised in support of the rioters as he entered the Capitol to vote on scrapping the Electoral College results. This vote was interrupted when his buddies started smashing up the place. But when Congress reconvened later that night to finish voting, 8 senators and 139 House representatives still cast their lot with Trump and his absurd lies. To no one's surprise, all Republicans. So, to sum up the crowd at the Capitol Hill riot, it's an accurate depiction of what the Republican base has become. Misguided workers swindled by a cult of personality, wealthy business owners, QAnon cultists, white supremacists, and elected officials who would gladly fall on their sword to please Donald Trump. Let's move on to Chapter 3. Okay, so we know what happened and we know who's responsible, but why did they do it? What was the reasoning behind the riot? Just like there was no one single type of Trump supporter in the crowd, there were many distinct goals among the rioters. For many, simply getting into the Capitol building was a victory. It didn't accomplish anything, but it made them feel good. For others, there was a much more sinister goal in mind. Remember the picture of the guy with the flex cuffs? At least some of the insurrectionists were hoping to take hostages. What they intended to do with them is anyone's guess. But judging by the fact that they were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence, the Republican vice president," it doesn't take much imagination to assume that they were perfectly willing and probably eager to harm any Democrats they could get their hands on. But there was one overarching goal that united the mob: stop the steal. Simple slogans like "Stop the Steal" are incredibly effective. They provide a rallying cry and a reminder of what they hope to achieve. In this case, the end goal was overturning the results of the election and installing Donald Trump as president instead of Joe Biden. Donald Trump, a man who gave these people next to nothing, only cares about himself and his rich buddies, and who lost the electoral vote and the popular vote by 7 million votes. The word coup has been used a lot in the last week. In some regards, it's appropriate. There was a group of people who tried to violently change the result of an election. But on the other hand, look at what happened once they breached the Capitol. Most of the crowd just started messing around. They sat in some chairs, stole the speaker's lectern, took some selfies, chanted some slogans, but that was it. They didn't go to any other government buildings, they didn't pursue evacuating politicians. As far as we can tell, they didn't really have any concrete plans at all. Not to step on any patriotic toes, but it doesn't really count as a revolution if you're trying to keep a president in power. When other countries riot and storm their seats of government, it's usually to demand changes that will materially improve their lives. What will keeping Trump in power accomplish? He doesn't care about the working class, who actually need material help, and the millionaires won't suffer under a Biden presidency. Biden is a corporate centrist dedicated to maintaining the status quo, and that means continued pandering to massive corporations and crippling austerity for the rest of us. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump disowned the crowd. Conservatives, he threw you under the bus when the riot became inconvenient to him. This is something that many on the right are beginning to come to grips with. This whole time, Trump wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't playing 4D chess, he was just a bigoted old man who knew how to push the buttons of his followers. He's a showman. He played his followers, encouraged them to fight for him, and then cast them aside when they risked their lives to deliver him the presidency. So no, this wasn't a coup. I suppose you could make the argument that if somehow they had actually captured the entire government, it would have been an actual coup because then they could have made real demands. But they didn't, and there's no indication that it was organized enough to do so. Nor were there any specific demands behind the slogan "Stop the Steal." The crowd may not have had any real chance of success, but regardless of their effectiveness, there will be very real consequences for the people of the United States. In the aftermath of the Capitol riot, we've begun to see a social media crackdown and the expansion of the surveillance state. The president was suspended from Twitter, along with over 150,000 other accounts, including over 7,000 related to QAnon. Parler, the most well-known hive of white supremacists and QAnon followers, was threatened and then suspended for refusing to moderate hate speech and content inciting violence, at which point a reported 600,000 new users flocked to Gab, another site willing to host their hateful ideology. The discussion around social media censorship is fraught, with some asserting that banning vile accounts is a good thing, while others claim it's a slippery slope and will be used against any number of other groups. If you want my 2 cents, here goes. You can be glad to see fascism dealt a body blow and also concerned about the precedent this sets at the same time. Fascism, white supremacy, Nazism, cults completely detached from reality, these are all objectively bad. Limiting their recruiting power is a net good. Do tech companies have too much power in curating the online conversation? Absolutely. But I won't cry over the loss of literal Nazis. For those who say this will be used to justify banning left-wing accounts, trust me, I know. Censorship and bans have been leveled at the left for years. It's not like suddenly we'll face a new threat. This already happens all the time. Tech censorship affected the left far more than the right up until the Capitol Hill riot, because the US is vastly more afraid of communism than it is of fascism. All that aside, now that the right is getting a taste of the free market deciding not to put up with their nonsense, maybe we'll actually see a growing consensus that corporations have too much power. Perhaps more concerning than the social media crackdown is the new justification for state surveillance. The FBI are suddenly the good guys for trying to identify right-wing agitators. Many on the left are gleefully turning in co-workers to the feds, and this is exactly what the powers that be want. This whole debacle is an incredibly convenient way for our leaders to normalize asking us to turn in our neighbors for perceived crimes against the state. Today, that crime is breaking windows at the Capitol. But what will it be tomorrow? I got a visit from DHS for supposed anti-American sentiment in my videos. How long will it be until making YouTube videos saying we should improve society is a crime against the state? To emphasize my point, and to quote the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Biden has said he plans to make a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism, and he has been urged to create a White House post overseeing the fight against ideologically inspired violent extremists and increasing funding to combat them. Well, that's delightfully vague, isn't it? Even if Biden were to define terrorism as something most people agree upon, there's nothing stopping the next president from criminalizing something entirely different. This legislation will 100% be used more viciously against the left than the right. Look how the Black Lives Matter protesters were treated. It was a bloodbath, and they were far more peaceful than the Capitol Hill goons. I guarantee you that Black Lives Matter will be classified as ideologically inspired violent extremism. Laws that are left intentionally vague like this give the state a blank check to commit acts of horrible violence against their citizens. There is a precedent for this. At the height of the Red Scare, there was a group known as the House Un-American Activities Committee. Its prime function was to conduct investigations, or more accurately, baseless witch hunts, under the direction of Joseph McCarthy, from whom we get the term McCarthyism, the accusation completely without evidence that a U.S. citizen is guilty of treason for being a suspected communist.
I don't think you have any conception of the danger of the Communist Party.
I want to make it clear that the United States Army does not coddle communists.
Unsurprisingly, we see a lot of this behavior even today. Many of the rioters were certain they were the only thing standing between the United States and communism, and news networks routinely equate communism with fascism, completely ignoring the fact that the US allied with the communists to defeat the fascists in World War II, which would indicate that one is indeed worse than the other. But regardless of how you feel about your friendly neighborhood communists, Biden's new anti-terror legislation will result in the baseless arrest of innocent Americans. Another consequence of the coup d'etat, or beer gut putsch if you prefer, is the enacting of a new batch of no-fly orders. Here's some footage of a rioter who's just been informed he can't get on his flight because he was identified as being present at the Capitol.
I love every single one of you, but this is what they do to us. They kicked me off the plane, they called me a fucking terrorist, and they want to fucking ruin my life.
As much as watching mildly inconvenienced Trump supporters may delight some people, we need to again think about this in terms of state abuse of power. Pair this no-fly rule with Biden's proposed anti-extremism legislation. Are climate activists extremists? Black Lives Matter protesters? Am I an extremist since I've been visited by the DHS? If I were to participate in a march for Medicare for All in DC, then I tried to get on a flight back home, would that trigger an arrest? Anti-terrorism laws always have disproportionately negative effects on the population they're supposed to protect. This time will be no different. One final consequence of the riot is the proposed impeachment of Donald Trump less than 2 weeks before the end of his term. I get it. He played a role in inciting his supporters to do violence. But casting Trump as the source of all America's problems is foolish. If we allow him to become this sacrificial goat, all the sins of the modern GOP projected onto the supposed anomaly that is Trump, we're letting Republicans off the hook for what has become mainstream conservative thought. Trump is not an anomaly. He is the embodiment of American conservative ideology. Fully 45% of Republicans support the assault on the Capitol, and that's just those who will admit it. Will removing Trump from office send a symbolic message that even a president can't get away with everything? Sure, in theory, but I just don't see it happening. In order to maintain the national myth of moral superiority, the president must be above the law. The president's job is to do horrible things. Order assassinations around the world, bomb schools and hospitals, overthrow governments and install puppet regimes, enact crippling sanctions to starve entire countries. The only difference is that Trump incited a bit of violence at home. The question is, will kicking him out or keeping him in better maintain the facade of moral superiority? That will determine the result of any impeachment hearings, which will probably already have occurred by the time this video goes live. Okay, this episode has gone on long enough. Let's move on to the final chapter. What does all this mean for American politics and the future of the country?
They're going to have to, we need a Republican Party. We need an opposition that's principled and strong. And I think you're going to see them going through this idea of what constitutes a Republican Party.
Let's start with this ridiculous statement. We do not need a strong Republican Party. A strong Republican Party just tried to overturn the results of the election. We need to be honest here. The Republican Party has gone completely off the rails. They have open contempt for 99% of Americans. They think their voters are morons. Many of them are white supremacists and have zero regard for actual democracy. But more than that, a strong Republican Party is what has allowed Democrats to get away with doing nothing for years. Universal healthcare? Wish we could, but those darn Republicans are making it too difficult. Investment in green energy? Geez, sorry, the Republicans need that money for the military. Police reform? Well, we would, but the Republicans are stonewalling. The only reason the Democrats want a strong Republican Party is because the two parties rely on each other to maintain the status quo. They are both right-wing corporate parties beholden to massive corporations and billionaire donors. They play the identity politics game, casting each other as the greatest evil and a threat to the American way of life. Leadership changes hands every few years, and nothing ever changes. If Biden actually wanted to make real, positive, lasting changes, he would be taking advantage of the Capitol riot and blasting the Republicans 24/7, not asking people to be nice and unify with them. From people besides the political establishment, I understand the calls for unity. I really do. It would be much nicer if everyone could just get along. But that is nowhere close to the reality of modern America. We are more divided than ever, and in ways that are fundamental and impossible to compromise on. The people who stormed the Capitol think Jews, black people, gay people, and countless other groups are subhuman and deserve to be exterminated. I will not concede 1 inch of ideological ground to these people. I will be understanding of working-class Trump voters who have real economic concerns. Millions of Americans share those concerns, but we cannot stoop to barbarism and defend heinous ideas with the shield of economic anxiety. The Capitol riot has made many things clear. One of them is that the Blue Lives Matter movement was never about respecting police, it was about supporting cops brutalizing black people. It was a deeply reactionary ideology like the rest of American conservatism. Any economic progress must come without the baggage of white nationalism, fascism, or any kind of bigotry espoused by Trump's most vocal supporters. The late Michael Brooks always said, "Be kind to people, be ruthless with institutions." Trump voters are our fellow human beings. We have to do what we can to help them shed their bad ideas without labeling them all a lost cause. The Republican Party, on the other hand, is a lost cause. It has shifted so far to the right that it's flirting with ideas that should alarm every American, not just the left. We have Republican elected officials suggesting that democracy is mob rule and that it's a bad way to organize a nation. The modern Democratic Party is as far to the right as we should entertain. The Republicans have dragged the Democrats to where the Republican Party was 3 or 4 decades ago. We do not need 2 right-wing parties in America. We need to relegate the Republican Party to the trash heap and build an actual left party to balance out the corporate Democrats. It's also been made clear that the Democrats are just as willing as the Republicans to use authoritarian tactics. In the wake of the George Floyd protests, Biden has said that he wants to increase police funding. In the aftermath of the Capitol Hill riot, he's said he wants to expand the surveillance state. The grip of the state tightens with each new administration, Republican or Democrat. That being said, the Democrats have not yet instigated mobs to try to change the outcome of an election. The Republicans have done it twice in the last 2 decades, and they got their desired outcome in 2000. The last thing we need to consider is that there has to be nuance when discussing uprisings like this one. People will always try to judge things by a universal metric, saying things like, "It is always bad to use direct action against the government." Resisting the government is not itself inherently wrong. It's what built this country. The reason the Capitol insurrection was bad was not because of the nature of uprisings, but because its reasons were pointless and terrible. What would overturning the election results accomplish? Giving the loser of the election power, and that's it. Donald Trump has been an incompetent president. He's weakened our alliances with friendly nations, made new enemies, refused to make common sense reforms or pursue climate goals, disarmament, or any humanitarian projects, and has not materially improved the lives of average Americans in any way. Keeping Trump in power is a bad reason to storm the Capitol. Consider why other nations rise against their leaders: to oppose crippling austerity, to demand better healthcare or necessary reforms. Always things that materially improve the lives of the vast majority of citizens. It would be foolish to look at the Trump riot and a hypothetical uprising over healthcare and say, these 2 things are the same. We in America have completely lost our understanding of class struggle. I can't imagine a more counterproductive effort than trying to overthrow the government to keep the rich guy who did nothing for you in power. As a result, we've got increased police budgets, increased surveillance, a social media crackdown, and sweeping new, vague anti-terror legislation. If you're going to make a fuss, at least have concrete demands and make sure it's for a good reason. Healthcare is the obvious example that comes to mind in America because our healthcare system is the most expensive in the developed world, routinely bankrupts people, has the worst outcomes of any developed nation, and goes away completely when we lose our jobs, which we've found out is pretty devastating in the middle of a pandemic. So, to sum up a very long and frustrating topic, the Capitol riot was a foolish display of the worst tendencies of American politics. It exposed the ugly underbelly of modern conservatism, and the government response to it is also incredibly alarming. We are living in what's becoming more and more of a police state, with a petulant loser in charge of the nuclear arsenal, where half of Americans choose to cast their lot with bigots, racist, exploitative billionaires, and literal Nazis. We have no concept of what actual progress would look like, and the incoming administration is addicted to failure and terrified of actually having the power to govern. We're in a tough spot, and if the last week has proven anything, it's that the rest of the world is watching closely. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is supported by my patrons on Patreon. This kind of video, while very important, is something that sponsors won't touch. To keep my channel running, I rely on sponsors, AdSense revenue, and donations from generous viewers. By producing content like this, I lose out on both sponsors and AdSense. If you enjoy the kind of videos I'm producing and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. You can find my Patreon page, join our Discord server, and get early access to every video at patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.